Hello and welcome to another Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode of the podcast, we'll be looking at Ancient Warfare Volume 9, Issue 6, The Aftermath of Battle. Today I'm joined by Josho Brouwers, Lindsay Powell, Murray Dahm, Matt McCaffery and Cezary Kucewicz. Josho, I think this is a great issue of the magazine. I wondered if there was any articles that never made it into the issue.
I have no idea. Because I just finished off 10.2. It's just gone off to the printers now on the Ptolemaic Egypt. And the previous one was the Peloponnesian War. And then it was this one. And I don't really remember the amount of proposals. What I do remember was that there were almost no Roman proposals. It was nearly all Greek, basically. What I could get as far as the Romans are concerned, I put in this, I think. I get about 20 proposals for every issue of Ancient Warfare. Usually it's more, sometimes it's a little less, but usually it's 20 is about the minimum. So I imagine it would have been 20 for this also. And the thing was that there were also a few proposals that weren't really about the aftermath of battle. I got a lot of questions from people saying, what do you mean precisely with the aftermath of battle? What is included or is not? And a few of them did not understand as far as I can remember. And most of them were ancient Greek. And like I said, I think all the ones that I got on Rome, I put in here.
But if we start at the beginning, the outcome of the battle is sort of... the aftermath of the battle is the immediate outcome is the battlefield itself. And Stuart from Facebook, from the Facebook page, as opposed to Stuart who worked for Facebook, asks, ancient battles tended to be confined to certain areas, so I imagine the aftermath would be rather bloody, such as Cannae. I wondered if anyone cleared it up afterwards, or was it just left as some kind of monument?
There's discussion, burying the dead certainly is something that happens, but then there's also battles where, the piles of dead survive, most famously in Tacitus and oh gosh, come on brain, the aftermath where Tiberius comes across the remains of, do you know what
Legions
I'm talking
of
about?
Varus.
That's the one. Oh, that one. Yeah, that one. That's the one I forget,
yeah.
Of course. But no, normally
battle in the Teutoburg Forest, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. And then, of course, there's the normally it's the giving back of the dead and the burying of dead. We know that at Thermopylae the dead are buried, and we know that at Leuctra, for instance, Epaminondas allows everyone but the Spartans to collect their dead first, so that the number of Spartan dead will be seen, so that they can't exaggerate or minimize the extent of the Spartan losses. So, the buried dead did get buried, and there are monuments to the dead that are created in some battles, Coronea and Marathon, obviously, Mr.
Well, I was actually going to throw the example of the Bar Kokhba War, which I've been reading a lot about recently. It is, for example, the archaeology of one particular site, which was found near Batir, which was the last stand of Kokhba. In fact, the archaeology shows that there were piles of bodies that were left exposed, and it was through the wear of the bones and osteopathy that archaeologists could determine that that's what had happened. And only later were they actually buried. And that dovetails with, I think, Cassius Dio or some of the rabbinic documents, which suggest that there were so many casualties. Part of the punishment was to leave them unburied. It was a very, very significant development. I mean, it was a direct insult to Jews, clearly, because that was irreligious not to bury the body. But it was a signal to everybody else. You stand against Rome, we will impose a startling devastation. It is another means of war making.
Well, that's also the nightmare, of course, in the Iliad. I mean, Cezary will know all about this, of course, is that leaving somebody for the dogs and crows, basically, is sort of like cursing somebody, not giving them a proper burial.
Yeah, though I think it's very interesting in the Iliad that there's loads of that. So we hear of the animals, the vultures, the birds, the dogs, and it seems to be like this biggest horror that may actually happen to you. But when you look at other Greek sources, especially from the 5th century, there's nothing like that. So actually Homer's Iliad is a bit of an exception, which always really baffled me. The amount of unburied bodies there and what you can actually do to the dead body as well, like what happens to Hector and a few other blokes. That's something that's really not Greek, as far as we're concerned in the 5th century. So that always really baffled me. Because as far as we're concerned in the 5th century, the Greeks really do look after their dead, and they really do dispose of every single one, whether it's enemy or friend.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that at Thermopylae, the Greeks also buried the Persian dead, whereas in Zoroastrianism, if I recall correctly, you're not supposed to bury the dead.
No, they're exposed usually, aren't they?
There the Greeks tried to be pious and did the
wrong thing.
in the Persians by not burying them, or by not leaving them exposed.
Well, the other famous example, of course, is Germanicus goes with his army across the Rhine to the territory where presumably the Teutoburg battle is fought, or one of the parts of the battle, and they find these bleached bones exposed, and they actually go through a ceremony of burying the bones, which apparently, from the point of view, because of its status, from the political and the legal perspective, Germanicus is not supposed to do that, but he's able to pull back, say that, well, Marius had done this before, so in fact, irrespective, it is the right thing to do for us to bury our countrymen.
He's a priest at the time, so he shouldn't be anywhere near the dead. He shouldn't be actually looking.
That's exactly right. So what's very interesting is that the Germans clearly see as part of the humiliation of the Romans is actually to leave their bodies nailed to trees and, just a pile of bones. And the Romans see it as an obligation, and that Tacitus is very, very descriptive in this depiction of how Romans don't know whether this bone could be related to him somehow because he's a long-lost cousin or a brother. It's very emotional in the way it's told. So it's a very vivid picture.
And it's gone from my brain. There's also the... no, it's gone. Of course, it was going to be important.
Well, normally it's your microphone giving out. I've got something really important to say.
Yeah, absolutely. You've seen through my strategy now, because it's a brain fade, but I at least had my microphone to rely on in the past.
So presumably it was important for troops to understand that at least in death that their bodies would be cared for or respected. So presumably there's some it's a two-sided thing. Even the vanquished will be looked after by the victors.
Well, I think especially in like Cezary was saying, in terms of the 5th century, you've got the fact that we've got roughly the same culture, and therefore the treatment of the dead is understood. And again, that example of Thermopylae, where the Greeks treat the Persian dead as dead should be treated, and they've actually behaved in the wrong manner because of that cultural divide. And there are other examples of cultural clashes where cultural behaviour is misunderstood from one culture to the other in war. But I think that one of the things with Greek treatment of the dead is obviously that it's the same culture and it's the same treatment across most of Greek culture throughout the period.
I suppose one thing I wanted to add as well to how it was with the Greeks and the Persians is that, the Greeks are very sort of respectful after Marathon because they do bury them. But what it sort of relates to the first question as well as to what happens to the battlefield and is it cleaned or not. So when the roles are reversed and it's the Persians dealing with the Greek bodies, I think what you hear from Herodotus is that actually what they do is they organize like sightseeing tours. So if anyone wants to see the Greek dead, they're there to see, and Herodotus says that the interest was really great because so many people wanted to see the Greeks being defeated. So
the Greeks do that as well, don't they? I mean, in terms of, you hear about after Marathon, the Spartans arrive and they do a bit of a tour of the battlefield. And give their evaluation of how the battle went for the Athenians. So there seems to be the implication that there's something there to be inspected.
Battlefield tourism.
Well, in the case of Marathon, it was more that the Spartans arrived late after the Athenians had already won, and the bodies were still there, so that's why they... I don't think the Athenians deliberately thought, let's keep everybody here above ground, so when the Spartans finally show up, we can rub their noses into the fact that we killed all these people.
So it's a matter of how long they were there. I mean, how long after is it that the Spartans actually turn up? I don't think that's really made clear.
I think the other thing is obviously that a lot of the time a trophy is set up with the arms and armour of the defeated, and we have several battles where there's confusion because both sides set up a trophy. So in terms of that touring the battlefield, and especially again it raises the Thismos debate. You know, when you have a rugby scrum, a small one with only 16 people in it, you get churned up ground. So presumably in some of these battlefields there would be a literal footprint of the battle, and if you have trophies in several places, you could in fact tour the battlefield for quite a while afterwards and know what had happened. And of course, your veterans are going to tell you, well, this happened and this is where the line broke and this is where we set up our trophy. So I think that it wouldn't necessarily need physical bodies to be able to do tours of the battlefield. And then of course there's battlefields that get reused, not only Mantinea and others. I mean, I was reading that the Battle of Hysiae was regarded as a in modern scholarship. Two scholars have said that it was an invention of the Argives, and then in fact Sparta didn't get defeated at Hysiae, but there were, and the only evidence for it is these grave markers from Argos, and then the story is, oh yes, that's where the Argives defeated Sparta, in 669, whereas perhaps those graves could have been from any one of the subsequent battles in that field.
For later battles, you're also going to get the siege works and whatnot that are going to be long-lasting, so you'll have that to tour. Thinking about the later Republican Romans and going to somewhere like Alesia and seeing what Caesar's left there as such.
Yeah. Well, even somewhere like Masada to this day, the siege ramp is still there.
Smyrna also, the Lydian siege ramp was also excavated. It was still there from the 6th century BC.
My reading, though, I think that once the battle, for example, like a siege, and I've reading Caesar's Civil War recently, where in one particular situation that the Caesar side had broken into the city and there was a kind of surrender, and then there was some trickery on the part of the siege people. And they kind of do this rush out, and of course they then get punished even more. I just wonder whether you seem to be suggesting that there's tourism, that people actually making point to actually go visit these sites, as it's like the Gettysburg battlefield, and people sort of watching on the sidelines. Is there any evidence for that? It sounds extraordinary if that's true.
I think there is, and I've written down here as note to Murray, ancient battlefield tourism ? Because I think there probably was. I think there, certainly Marathon there was. The monuments set up for the dead, the Boeotian monument for the sacred band and the mound at Thermopylae, as well as other evidence of the dead fallen where they fell and buried where they fell. I think there's probably, that's the whole purpose of it.
I was thinking more in the immediate weeks or months, but you make a very good point, which is to say, for example, the Augustan period. Of course, Nicopolis, both in Epirus and also in Egypt, were victory cities. And the one clearly built in Epirus was a celebration by then Imperator Caesar of his victory over Antony and Cleopatra, complete with ship's beaks and temple and all the rest of it.
Yep.
That was clearly developed around the idea of a cultural tourism celebrating victory.
Yep.
One in the vicinity of Alexandria was so much of a draw for new business and development, apparently, that some of the older temples in the old Alexandria started to fall into disrepair because people had basically relocated to the brand new shiny city of Nicopolis next door.
I mean, the idea of tourism, there's certainly tourist goods for, visit Napoleonic battlefields and certainly Waterloo in the First World War. But I wonder if what the reason behind visiting battlefields is. I mean, presumably this is not to see where their family have fallen. Presumably it's more of a political reasons, stamping your authority, sort of encouraging people to say, we've beaten them, look, this is...
I'm not sure. I think it's also just curiosity. I mean, when you look at the examples, not just of battlefield tourism, but for instance, temple tourism, the number of Greeks who travel to various different temples, and even just taking the example of Libanius for instance, he goes around to whatever temple he's told to go to cure all of his manifest illnesses, and he goes to this temple and that temple, and then of course you've got writers like Pausanias, who does an entire tour and records everything of interest that he's told. And he reports local legends when he's in particular areas, and often he's the only source for that material. So that must be, his people are taking him and explaining what this thing is, and he then passes that down in his description of Greece. And of course, we all know about Herodotus supposedly being a tourist and being misled by Egyptian priests. So I think there's probably actually a wider, not in the sense of tourists in a modern sense, but there is a tourism of sites and a tourism of places and culture, rather than it just being a political, large body kind of work. It's individuals going and being interested in the history of place, the history of culture, the history of events. So maybe it's an industry.
Very much like, for example, modern people. For example, if anybody's interested in the Revolutionary War over here, you almost take a pilgrimage to Yorktown, and I have to say I got quite welled up when I got to Yorktown because I realised everything went perfect. And done a very good job there. From one of the readouts, you're able to listen to this audio commentary with the world turned upside down song, which apparently is not actually accurate, but apparently has become latched onto that battle. And somebody with Gettysburg or Culloden or anything else. I mean, we are curious.
We've just had Anzac Day, and of course New Zealanders and Australians have a pilgrimage to Anzac, every year, and there's a dawn service, and last year was the 100th anniversary of the Anzac invasion in 1915, so there were hundreds of thousands of Kiwis and Aussies over there, so it still happens, and it really is. It's a bizarre cultural phenomenon now that really has nothing to do with an English government sending Australian and New Zealand troops to die in Turkey. It's become about mateship and a fair go and Australianism, which is a really weird kind of cultural hijacking of the actual significance of the battle. But I seem to be alone in my thinking on that, so I'll hush now.
No, but I think you've got 2 points there. One, in terms of the propaganda value, and also not moving too far away from Gallipoli in terms of Troy in the ancient world is a site to be visited by loads of individuals who are it's making a connection with a glorious past, just like Caesar and Pompey going to view the body of Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great in turn going to have naked races with his mates round the Mount of Troy to link to the past. There's a propaganda there to be made the most of.
Yeah.
I was going to say, make a very interesting point, because when I was researching about Germanicus, on his way to Syria, he stops off at what we would now call Hyssop, which in those days, of course, actually had Ilium, the Roman town, which had built its reputation on this sort of legendary story. And there's, again, in Tacitus, the story how he was taken to the battlefield on the Scamander River and saw all these great things. And, of course, he fancied himself as an historian. He just recently stopped off at McCaffery to see what was going on there, because, of course, his own family, his own, I guess, would it be his grandfather, Mark Antony, was actually one of the participants. So there was lots of story sharing, I'm sure.
And even Alexander the Great at Siwa, tracing Hercules' steps, and even I think Trajan marks the spot which was the furthest point that Alexander got to, and Cassius Dio has a moment, that I got further than Alexander, which is the whole point.
Mary was saying earlier about the people erecting these trophies on the battle sites. The one thing I found out in my research was it became a sacred monument, and you were not allowed to desecrate it or take it down. You can imagine you've got these eerie things that in these battlefields you might have the remains of 100-year-old sort of trophy with rags and bits of rusty metal hanging on them still, and they would sort of groan as the wind blows. I mean, it would have been quite spooky in its own way, but these sites, in a sense, became venerated. And it's interesting, when we had an article issued several years ago, in fact, about religious practice and ancient warfare. I think this is very interesting, the intersection of the two things, that there's a religious component to the battlefield, because it's a place of killing, but it's also a place of victory, and those two things intersect with one god battling against another god, and there's a victor and there's a vanquished, and so on.
I mean, it's also because our sources are not really concentrating on it. There's that there must have been hundreds of battle trophies littering the place, some of which would have been maintained and some of which presumably wouldn't have been. So these piles of rusty armour and things like that. And I mean, there's one example of a monument to Marius in 42 BC, and I think it's only recorded in one of the summaries of Livy, but it's enough to be an omen that the monument itself shifts its axis. But you've got a victory of Marius presumably 60 years earlier, and then all of the political propaganda about the Marius becoming a damnatio memoriae and things like that, and yet the monument to his victory against the Cimbri and the Teutones is still maintained 60 years later in the town of Mutina. So absolutely, there's these amazingly long cultural memories of battlefields and the dead. So I think we're onto something.
You've also got the respect being shown between different cultures, because I mean, Caesar, I think of Plutarch that tells it. Caesar going and seeing a sword that supposedly has been claimed to be his, that's been taken from him in battle, up in the Belgae, I think it is, one of the Belgae tribes, that they have it hanging somewhere in a public place, and he demands that it not be taken down, that they respect that somebody has actually taken it from him, and good on them.
Yeah, well, Appian has the story of Pompey being given Alexander's cloak to wear in the Triumph back in Rome. So,
and on that subject of the Triumphs, it's very interesting that again in the article I wrote, which is about how Augustus very cleverly took the idea of the trophy, which was assumedly a tree with larva roped on, so very much an organic structure. The problem is it would rot over time. The idea was to make it a permanent marker, so you'd either build one on the battle site, but more importantly, you'd actually bring it home. You'd actually start to populate the city of Rome with these markers, these triumphal arches, the obvious one, and on several coins there are indications that the trophy is actually part of the sculpture of the triumphal arch, and also the fact that they would build triumphal arches in different places. So, for example, there's famously one in France, the Arc de Triomphe of Orange, I think it is, which is a demonstration of Roman power. It's actually got literally depictions of captured arms and armour. I mean, it literally is a trophy in an arch. When Bar Kokhba was defeated in 136, several of his commanders were given triumphal ornaments, but Hadrian arranged so that there would be an arch in Tel Shalem. The inscription has been partly found, and it was colossal. It was designed to send a message: we have conquered this place. And oh, by the way, it's no longer called Judea, it's Syria Palestina. We have scrubbed you out of the history books.
Yeah, well, I think the Triumphal Arch in Richborough is another one. That's it's the gateway to Britain, and it's where you land, and it's the first thing you go through. And I was watching a documentary which was estimating it was 200 meters tall, which I was just no.
20 meters maybe.
20 maybe. Those damn decimals.
When you think about it, also, I mean, I don't know if it's true of Greek cities, but certainly of Roman cities. Temples were themselves associated with victory for the most part. So going back to the religious issue that we published several years ago, we discussed there that, for example, a Roman commander would make a pledge to a god: bring me victory and I will erect a temple in your name. So Rome is gradually populated with these temples, most of which by the time of Augustus and Tiberius have fallen into a terrible state of disrepair. I mean, thunder and lightning and rotted timbers, the whole works. So one of the acts of piety for Augustus and also his successors go through is this ongoing process of renovating the temples to show their ongoing piety to the order of the gods. So you can even sort of say that towns themselves become these collections of victory monuments.
Well, the Greeks, of course, dedicate military paraphernalia after a victory. We have famous examples of shields and helmets and weapons at Delphi and in other places. So I think there's and that exists right through the period.
And they dedicated so much of this stuff that periodically they had to clean everything out and bury it in a ditch just to make space for more.
I like the lovely story. There's a story in Herodotus of the sacred weapons from the Temple of Apollo moving of their own accord as the Persians approached Delphi in 480. And then there's another story of Epaminondas having the sculpture of Athena reshaped so that she's carrying her shield, and B, having the weapons dedicated to Heracles taken out of the temple so that it was all signs that they should be going to war. And I love the Delphi one, because I just think that there's a whole pile of kids in the streets of Delphi who've been playing with the weapons, and they drop them when the priest comes and he sees them in the middle of the street and says, "Oh, amazing!" But it's actually like a bunch of Greek children are hiding around the corner who were just almost busted. But anyway, that's not the story that Herodotus records.
I think that the really interesting phenomenon with the Greeks are that in those big sort of pan-Hellenic sanctuaries like Delphi or Olympia, what they do is they do obviously dedicate all this stuff, and as Josho said, there's so much stuff that they need to do, like a clearing every now and then. But then from about like the middle of the 5th century, the numbers actually drop, and it seems that what they do is that all of a sudden they feel like we actually shouldn't be doing this, because it's Greeks fighting Greeks. So this is not right anymore, which always strikes me as a sort of sudden realization that this is actually wrong. Though at the same time, you have those many dedications in those big pan-Hellenic sanctuaries, but you also have loads like in the city sanctuaries, which also have loads of dedications, and these actually do continue as you would imagine, because they sort of are this big image of the sort of city's heritage and victories. So
the point that, for example, again, look at the Roman perspective on this, is they distinguish between types of spoils. So, for example, there's the booty, which is the prydia. This is the stuff that the trash and trinkets, if you like, the individual stuff that can be sold on the open market, raises cash, and you can use that to pay for public buildings. Most famous, of course, is the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheatre, which was paid ex manubii, all the spoils, the booty from the first Jewish war of 1773. But they also distinguish between the spolia, which is to say revered stuff, so the stuff that would go hanging on the trophy, or some other kind of helmet or something. And I wonder whether, going back to the Greeks, they had something similar. They would discriminate between low-grade stuff which you could sell and make some money off, and then the other stuff which you would never sell because it has almost religious significance.
Well, there's the stripping of the dead, which can be to take the arms of that individual as your own, which again there's examples in Homer and beyond. Then there's the stripping of the dead to make the trophy. So I think there probably was I'm not sure if there is a specific delineation in the sources, but there seems to be context that provides that if you erect the trophy from arms and armor stripped from the dead, that was sacred, as was the shield of XYZ taken to be dedicated in the temple, and then presumably the rest of it was portable wealth, or free upgrades to your armor or weaponry.
I mean, what you hear in the sources from the 5th century is that what happened, especially with the Athenian army, is they actually each army had those like booty sellers essentially like following the army. So the way we imagine what happened is they would get most of that stuff, and then they would either sell it on behalf of the army of the city. But whether that worked like in practice with every single weapon or like every single piece of armor, I doubt it. I should think that the best, the nicest, would either go for the trophy or to the sanctuary, whereas all the other crap, I mean, if it could be sold, it would have. If you could reuse it, then you would. But a lot of this would actually, all the decisions would be made in some sort of central fashion. So you had those booty sellers, and what they were actually selling, we don't know. You would think they may have sold the weapons, or if they had any other goods on them. But one thing we do know for sure is that all the vanquished, all the bodies were actually really stripped naked. They would have nothing left on them. But as to what actually happened to the stuff, I mean, we can speculate.
Well, the other thing is, of course, there were a lot of living people still left over, and slavery itself, the capture of prisoners, was a very lucrative trade. So, and again, the two Jewish wars, I mean, there were vast numbers of people who were taken from Judea and moved elsewhere, and realized, and I think there were so many at one point, the price of an average slave went down to less than the meal of a horse. I think is one of the sources I read.
I think the same thing happens during the Gallic Wars, doesn't it? When Caesar's basically flooding Rome with Gallic slaves.
To a modern sensibility, I think most of us can understand the collecting of the militaria, the memorabilia sort of thing. But what really begins to crawl in our skin, I think, is the idea that it's the human captives. We come from a Geneva Conventions kind of perspective on this. There are no Geneva Conventions, and certainly in the Roman world, and they don't very much in the Greek one.
In ancient times, war was one of the main ways to somebody said, I don't remember the right, I'm pretty sure Cezary would know, I think it was maybe Connor, that war in ancient times was basically a mode of production, that it just added significantly to your economy in as far as you could get slaves, goods, booty, everything basically from the vanquished that would be sizable sums of money, or represent sizable sums of money at least, lots of wealth. That you couldn't really get in any other way in the ancient world.
It's like the Athenians being defeated in Sicily, and the whole bunch of captured Athenians being put to work in the mines there.
Well, at least they're not, Near Eastern or Egyptian or even Dacian, so therefore decapitated or had their hands chopped off as booty to show how many you defeated.
I mean, you can certainly see that in the 5th century, because I mean we have mentioned Homer a few times. But the way it works in Homer, or at least the way it seems it worked, is that it was all up for grabs. As in, if you killed someone, you had to essentially strip him right away, because there are many people after his armor. If he was one of the wealthy warriors. I mean, there were like many channels of redistribution after the battle, but it was all very hierarchical. So if you were an elite member, you would get most of the stuff, and you would divide that. But that led to, I mean, we believe, or some people believe, that was really, really discouraged later on, because you needed discipline. So you couldn't have soldiers just jumping out and grabbing stuff, saying, oh, this is mine, and claiming it, because that would really disrupt the phalanx. So that essentially disappeared, while army decided that we control everything after the battle.
Is that? I think that's what the sources says about Alcibiades when he falls, and Socrates defends his body. That they were going to try and strip him because he was Alcibiades, and therefore, even though he was only 18, he obviously probably had wealthy arms and armor, and Socrates defended his body from being stripped. And I was reading Pausanias's account of the unnamed battle, where he talks about the Messenians leaping at the Spartan phalanx and doing great deeds of daring do, and having no regard for personal safety, and courting death, and throwing themselves, and actually defeating the Spartans in that battle. And then Aristodemus at Plataea, to make amends for the fact that he survived Thermopylae with his infected eye, and throwing himself willy-nilly into the Persian ranks and trying to die in glory. And Herodotus says, I think he was the most courageous of the Spartans on the day, but the Spartans don't credit him at all, because he was trying to die, and there's these 3 other Spartans who did more deeds within the phalanx. So that's this amazing contrast between the Spartan way, which is discipline and phalanx, and then there's the non-Spartan way, which is, yes, there's the phalanx, but I can, run out of the phalanx and do amazing heroic deeds, just like Homer of old, and people will remember my conduct.
Herodotus is very strange in this combining of epic tradition and more civic-minded stuff. Also in his description about the description of the battle over Leonidas' body, for example, where it's written like a Homeric battle over a corpse. It's very epic in how it's described. So.
I'm actually myself really inclined to believe that this is how it once was, and I think it's something I mentioned in my article for the issue. It's this issue of, were there really fights over the dead during the battle or not? And I myself am inclined to believe that there were, like in the 6th, certainly the 7th century. The way I see this, and I argue, is that you actually see this theme of fighting over the dead being really prominent on the vases in the Attic art, and there's really loads of them. Like when you actually look at them, like I think I have the exact numbers in my article. But the Athenians really liked those images, and the Greeks liked to see those images. So I think that may suggest that this was something that they either experienced or looked up to or really idealized. Whereas in the 5th century, it just disappears. It really just disappears. So one may argue that maybe once the fighting really became really sort of more about the unit cohesion and closeness, maybe the phalanx, that's when it really had to go. Although you do have those mentions in Herodotus and later on, but they just seem a bit odd.
The thing is that kind of behaviour does continue. We have Romans, taking talks off Germans and Celts mid-battle, and you have all of the individual anecdotes of particular soldiers right through our, nearly every battle account has some individual deed of daring do, which presumably in the anonymity of the legion or the phalanx shouldn't happen.
Well, we have, of course, with the Romans, figures for the centurions. I mean, if you were promoted to become a centurion in the Roman army, your chances of dying increased by 80% or something. Because the centurions were stationed in the front rank, and they had to lead by example. So that meant that they would have to be the first to charge into the enemy, which is an excellent way to die, basically.
Absolutely.
So and I love it. Centurions is incredibly high, and that's sort of inspired by this kind of Homeric ideal. I mean, Landon in his book Soldiers and Ghosts sort of emphasizes the point, and I think he's correct that this Homeric ideal sort of informs a lot what the Greeks and Romans later did, and certainly the Romans were very ambitious in that regard, let's say.
Yeah, I like Caesar's centurion Scaever, who I think has 120 holes in his shield. It's just that all of those examples are of individual deeds of daring do. I love that. I'm using the 19th century phrase daring do. And that whole sort of idea, it stays with warfare, and the stripping of the dead, of course, goes right through into the Dark Ages. And we have Anglo-Saxon battles where it's all about Vikings stripping Anglo-Saxon dead, and it's all about gaining the wealth of the individual. So it's a constant in shield wall warfare for millennia.
Well, let me throw this into the mix. I'm just looking at here, Livius Perioci. There's the little scribble here about Book 141 by presumably the librarian, who writes, an account is given of the war that Drusus fought against the peoples across the Rhine. Among other important people fighting over there were Chumstincus and Evectius, military tribunes from the tribe of the Nervians. And that's all we know. So what great valor do they do? I don't know, but it certainly was important enough for Livy to write about. And I think what that hints at there, your point earlier, which was there are all these acts of valor and so on, no doubt, which became currency, and people have told stories and they sung songs. But we don't know about them. Performing what?
Acts of valor are still being performed, of course, by people in modern armies also. You still have medals for extraordinary conduct and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, even in modern armies where everybody wears uniforms and they're all basically dressed the same and equipped the same, and it's not emphasized that you have to be brave to prove your individual might, but it's still that afterwards, as people, we apparently feel a tendency to say, okay, everybody fought really well, but these people fought just slightly better than everybody else. I think it's something innate in human nature, I guess.
Well, I think the difference is now we have this medium called publishing, and of course people go tell their stories and they get written up into books, and they get a notoriety in life after that. And
not everybody. I mean, you get the archetypical image is the humble soldier who gets awarded a medal after performing a particular noteworthy deed recommended by an officer.
You get the crowns in the Romans as well. You get the crowns for going over the wall first or defending another citizen in battle and that sort of thing. So they, even if they die in the battle, that gets given to their family anyway.
I think there's a couple of books written about the continuation of that mentality into the Western war, into Victorian and beyond, and that other cultures don't necessarily have the same kinds of celebrations. I think there was someone talking about the when you look at the Vietnamese conduct and their rewarding of brave soldiers in the Vietnam War, compared to Purple Hearts and everything else on the American side, and yet there's not that celebration of individual action within the communist Vietnamese culture. they're just doing what they have to do, and it's expected that they do it, and there's not individual rewards for bravery the way there is in a Western context, which is fascinating.
I think the Soviets in the Second World War, weren't they similar?
They have the heroes of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's that interesting because it's about their dedication to the Soviet, not them as individuals, whereas the Victoria Cross, for instance, is and all of the other medals are awarded to individuals for their bravery, whereas the Soviet one seems to be a sort of an indication that they belong to the Soviet and their dedication to the communal group rather than individual action.
I've just been finished my recent book about Augustus at war, and the one thing that I tried to do there is pull together a table of all of the known recorded honours, donor medals and armour and all that stuff. And there were several occasions where, in fact, I came across inscriptions where the inscription basically said, "I was given this medal by Augustus," or "I was given this by Tiberius." And it raised the interesting thing that you actually have the senior commander of the army is actually giving out these in these personal ceremonies, and that must absolutely enhance the value of those awards.
But is that him giving it personally?
Yes.
Or is it like him saying, I was responsible for that victory, but actually it's being done by one of his generals as such?
The way I read it was in the literal sense that I got this from, because it's very interesting. There's another, I think it's probably again in Tacitus, where there's a scene where I think it's around about the time of the arrival of Tiberius back on the Rhine frontier, and the troops say, "I was with you in White here, and I was with you in this place, and I was with you," and they all celebrate this moment of the return of their commander that they followed through thick and thin and all the rest of it. So I've no reason to actually dispute that it wouldn't be. I mean, Augustus was in Hispania where these medals were given out, as indeed was Tiberius, and it's just this idea that they must have had this massed ceremony. The people get their day, their 15 minutes of fame. And it's amazing how junior some of these people are. And in fact, some of these people get repeat honours, and of course their tombstones become little mini monuments with, the armillae and the chest medals and all the rest of it, so that their own legend is created in their lifetime, which will then be passed on to the future generations.
I mean, that's a constant of warfare too, that humble troops calling out to their commander. Henry V gets it, Napoleon gets it, Montgomery gets it, Rommel gets it, probably Schwarzkopf and other commanders have got it, today, that soldiers calling out, "Oh, I was with you here, I was with you there, I was with you there." Yeah. And that whole idea of great generalship, of being told, "Who's that guy, 7th from the left?" Right, yeah. And then they go and say, "How are you doing, John? And how are the children? And how's the wife?" And all of the soldiers in the unit believe that their general knows all of that detail about all of them. But that is a constant from Alexander onward.
That comes through in the speeches before battle as well, doesn't it? Absolutely. So it's an amazing constant. And that medal ceremony, of course, the 19th century was modelling itself on what they perceived to be an ancient tradition in Rome, especially with the Napoleonic honours and the Legion Eagles and things like that. But also, when your Governor General gives you the Victoria Cross, it's the monarch who is giving you the medal, even though their representative is the one presenting it to you. And I know that that's millennia apart and it's analogous, but it would be very interesting if whether the Roman emperor would actually have a medal giving ceremony or a corona giving ceremony, or whether it would be done under his auspices by the governor or someone else.
I've no doubt that he did, because part of the propagandizing his own affirmation of himself as commander is to have that relationship. And it's very interesting. For example, Augustus refused to be called magister or one of those kinds of things, or dominus. He didn't want to be called comilitione by his troops. He was happy to call them soldier, and he wanted to be called imperator back. It established his distance with the hierarchy. The other thing I also remember from the research was how after Actium, many of the people actually adopted as their surname, their cognomen, Actiacus, was what they wanted to show. I was there, and I even call myself of Actium.
It's like saying in terms of Caesar again, when he's in Besançon, and there's the troop revolt, and his reaction to that is to get up in front of them and call them Quertes, rather than they're addressing as he normally would personally. It's giving them an insult. So again, emphasising that personal relationship.
Yeah, I also have this idea of him going up to the guys, please, give Give me a break.
Merchants, please go back to your work.
Yeah, so I have no doubt that the emperor would, where the opportunity for the so-called optics were good, it was a great morale booster, and of course it also appealed to this idea of competition. You want people to always give their best. And famously, Hadrian goes to South Africa, Mauritania, I forget where he reviews the troops, and he gives this speech about how well they've done the cavalry charge and all these other sorts of things. So I think it's part of the military story, and of course the battle is the ultimate assertion of power over another. And the emperor wants to take credit for that, and of course in the case of Augustus the tradition is collecting these number of imperatorial acclamations. So I think by the time he dies there's like 21 or 22 of them, and it becomes this tradition that you're all competing to get as many of these things as you can during your lifetime.
We've mentioned it a few times. We've touched upon the idea of a trophy on the battlefield. Our listener does specifically ask, what would they have looked like? Presumably, there are none remaining today.
Well, we have numismatic evidence from Rome of what they look like, and I think a lot of people extrapolate that out to that's what they always look like, which is essentially a T, a wooden T, and therefore helmets and armour and shields, and then piles of arms and armour and shields at the base to make it look like essentially to look like a very simplistic person, but made up of all the spoils, presumably the best or the most prominent individuals' weapons. And I think architecturally there are examples as well.
It's something I think, if I remember, that Virgil describes in the Aeneid, where it's a gory, gruesome-looking sculpture. It's deliberately an oak tree because that appeals to the idea of its connection with Mars. The other thing is the fact that this is probably dripping with blood. It's got rents and cuts in it. So it's not a perfect piece, but what it speaks very eloquently for is the giving up of the life of the one person in the name of the victor achieving victory. So you can imagine that this thing is erected with a certain amount of due pomp and circumstance, I'm sure. And you can imagine it clangs and rattles as the wind blows. It's not silent. It's a kind of ghostly scarecrow to a dead man or many dead men. It's a sort of wind chime of death, if you will. A wind chime of death.
Actually, with the what we know about them from the Greek side is we actually have some vases with trophies. So I have one example. I don't know if it will look really well. It's actually just an antique vase, and it shows, I think, Nike, which is sort of making that trophy. So that's the evidence we have for the Greek side.
But that's very similar to what we know from the coins of the 2nd century AD and beyond. So it's an amazing continuity of what a battlefield trophy looked like. Presumably there's only a couple of ways that you can actually set up a helmet, a cuirass, and shields. But as Lindsay was talking about Actium, that you take the prow and the beak of a ship to make your naval victory, and again we have that during the Greek period as well for naval victories. That's a very understandable element of a ship to take. And what we've got, of course, in modern terms is the flags, and in the Romans you've got the idea that they lose their standards. Presumably the enemies are displaying those standards somewhere, so that when Augustus says, well, I'm going to go and recover the standards, they weren't just binned or thrown away. They were actually displayed by foreign cultures as a trophy of victory for the victory over the Romans.
We've also got the use of Crassus's skull as some sort of
cup.
Well, the Germans that are given the individual eagles and the signa of the 3 legions lost at Teutoburg, actually do keep them in their versions of their sacred groves and temples, and the Romans are able to find them, 2 under Germanicus and 1, I think, under a general under Claudius. And of course, what the Augustan tradition with bringing back the standards from Crassus is he builds a whole damn forum and a temple around them. The famous of Mars Ultor and the Forum Augustum becomes a sort of a whole monumental sculpture erection, if you will, dedicated to this whole thing. He needs a place where they can be put and revered, the association with his legend as it's beginning to be cultivated, and Mars going all the way back to Aeneas. So it's very, very important, this sort of thing, and you'll find these battle standards ragged. They normally, I think, that's our version of paying reverence to the sort of sacrifices of our own troops. But what's very often is lacking in that context is you will not find, and I say this provocatively, swastikas and iron crosses that captured war spoils. So what that very, very importantly shows is our version of commemorating victory as opposed to celebrating victory, which is the ancient mindset, are diametrically opposed. I was amazed when I looked through my coin collection of how many, for example, of Trajan's coins, the denarii, are all about defeated Dacians in all kinds of different postures. Or when you look at Hadrian, he's going, and for example, the famous one of Vespasian, Judaea Capta. This is an appeal directly to we are victors, they are defeated. And can you only imagine what that would look like if we had actually issued coins? For example, Gaddafi defeated, or Saddam Hussein defeated, and had all this sort of image. It would make us, I don't know what it would make us feel, but it would be so alien to our way of thinking and so normal. And absolutely.
Well, it's not alien, it's not accepted. I mean, if you look at when there are photos of Americans posting with dead Vietnamese soldiers and later dead Iraqi soldiers.
But it was shocking.
It becomes shocking when it is leaked to the public, and there is an outcry where people say, "How can we do this?" But it's been done for millennia, for as long as people have been around, basically. So it's a normal part of when you fight against somebody and you finally vanquish them. You have this tendency to go, "Okay, now I'm just going to celebrate the fact that I managed to kill you all." But it's not commonly accepted to do that.
Not to mention stripping the dead. Soldiers strip the dead. That's how we got so many Japanese officers' swords. How many swastika flags came to the West in private collections? How many Vietnamese AK-47s turned up?
Your word is there. The important word is private. What I'm saying is that the ancient mindset, it's the public which is important. It's the public display of these things.
But I think the fact is that soldiers have always stripped their dead as a celebration of their individual prowess of killing them. And we're talking about the public aspect of it, and our public aspect of it is marches and awards ceremonies for valor during that campaign.
I think we're also ignoring the media today. I mean, there were no postage stamps or coins celebrating the deaths of Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, but we saw them on TV extensively. So in that case, it was a celebration of their deaths. Just it wasn't, we can't put this on a coin because that wouldn't be decent. But we throw it on TV and we show 24 hours a day and we talk about it all the time and we're very happy.
And the response from everybody watching it, I think, was revulsion.
You brought up the example of the publication. How soon after the death of Saddam Hussein was there a book about it? How soon after the fall of Gaddafi were there books about it? It's like weeks later, and those books sell thousands of copies.
Facebook, there were the photos and everything.
So, for example, in ancient Rome, Augustus would have had no compunction putting up, for example, a monument to celebrate his victory at Actium, which is actually over another Roman, by the way, so that's an interesting one to see. What you will not see anywhere in Europe is a similar monument which says Gaddafi, or whatever it is, with Libyan arms and armor, draped on a cross or something.
Because it's not necessary, because we have mass media. Back in Roman days, they didn't have mass media. Putting a statue up of something like that or releasing a coin, that was the way that you brought news out into the world. Now we have mass media. We have Facebook, we have TV.
Here's the point I'm making, is what we celebrate in the Western style is we have things like cenotaphs. We have monuments which are devoted to the fallen of war. So, for example, we have this vast infrastructure of Europe. For example, in London, there's this famous cenotaph. The ancient world equivalent was different. What they celebrated was the victory. What we do is we commemorate the victory as a sort of a loss, as a mourning of lives fallen. It's not a, yay, we won the war. That's what you do on VE Day or VJ Day.
Is that because there's a different need, though? Because there's a different political system. You need to, if you're a dictator, you need to announce your power and strength by announcing your victory, whereas that's different now.
When you look at the statues of Saddam Hussein or even of Stalin or other non-democratic military despots, a lot of their statutory is about their victory, and it's not as there aren't statues of the fallen, of them stepping on the heads of foes the way there was in ancient coinage, but there is that sense of I am the victor, I'm the one who won. There was the famous crossed scimitars in Baghdad, and even those are. There's that sort of sense of protector. I'm the protector of your culture and your city and your lives. So there is a more sinister aspect to non-Western democracy commemorations of military victory. And I think there are some macabre ones. You look at the number of burnt out tank carcasses that are around as commemorations of war. That they are absolutely an aspect of. They are a battlefield trophy. When you have a tank carcass in the middle of a modern city, like in Ho Chi Minh City, you've got that exact same thing that we had in the ancient world.
But you won't find that in London. You won't find that in Berlin. You'll find that in Ho Chi Minh City.
Oh, you find it outside of every RSL in Australia and New Zealand. Every RSA and RSL will have a weapon of war. Hyde Park in Sydney has a gun from the Emden, which is the World War I German raider that sank the HMAS Sydney 1. They're not emphasised now because I think we've moved on from what a celebration of victory was in World War I and World War II. And with the devastating war and with the amount of media we have, I think there is a saturation. People don't want to see a giant display of the enemy defeated in this day and age, but 50 years ago, it wasn't so much of a problem.
Well, does that show sophistication in knowing how to win a war? At one point you need this, and now you don't need that. You move it on again, and it's the same. When you win a battle, sometimes you show clemency, sometimes you hit people with an iron fist.
No, I think Josho's onto something there, but the amount of media coverage of it, and the fact that media coverage is no longer, back in the day of newsreel. You watch the newsreel and it was over. Whereas today in YouTube and Facebook, it's viral and it's there forever. So there is a saturation.
But one thing I wanted to add about this idea of the ancients celebrating victory and not so much the losses. I mean, what we see in Athens is that they do have those really. A really big thing is that the list of the war dead, which the Athenians do have, and they do actually erect them every year. It's always in the winter, and it lists everyone who died by name and by tribe. And for some of those years, that would actually be military defeats. So that although they weren't celebrating the defeat, they were celebrating the sacrifice. So it wasn't always about victory, but it was also about the sacrifice.
I think the Romans are also doing a lot to sanitize after certain victories. I mean, you've got Lustratio being used at times to sanitize the whole city, and you've got this idea of the gates of Janus being opened and closed, but it's more as a a public statement of reassurance that we have achieved victory, and putting up a monument like the Areopagus, it's making it all nice again after a victory.
Well, that's interesting because I did a whole thing about that. See, you get to the definition. What is the definition of pax, which we translate as peace, but doesn't comfortably translate in Latin. In fact, it's for Augustus, it's peace through victory.
Yeah.
It's not victory through strength. It's the fact that he has had victory. And by the way, in order to have a continuity of peace, you need to have a continuity of victories. So the ultimate lie, if you like, of the Augustan peace is that there can never be a total end victory because you have to keep having them for him to keep power. He has to have the army always at his disposal because the project isn't finished yet. I need another 5 years. The Senate vote to, and this goes on for like 4.5 decades. So it's a very clever manipulation of how he plays that game.
I have a curveball for you, Angus, and that is I finally remembered what I was going to say about the aftermath of battle, and it's either Horace or it's another Roman poet who talks about the fact that one of the phenomenon after great bloodshed on a battlefield is that the great rains come and cleanse the battlefield. So that's sort of a poetic recognition that whenever there's a bloody battle, rains come and they actually clean the field. So that idea of cleaning up afterwards seems to be something. And I've read some vague thing about the amount of bloodshed and the amount of heat given off actually creates a kind of an atmospheric effect which brings rains, but I'm not sure about where I found that. But that seems to be something that the poets certainly recognize as nature's way and the god's way of cleaning up battlefields.
And then, of course, the carrion birds, the vultures and all those as well. And, of course, the stench must have been indescribable.
Yeah, in the Mediterranean sun, baking for a few hours. I mean, there are reports of, for example, American soldiers on, I think it was in the Pacific, when soldiers had died and they had to wait to be picked up on an island or something, and they were just sitting there watching the bodies of their dead friends, get bloated in the sun, and then they'd have to back away because sooner or later they would explode, and then you couldn't take enough showers to get rid of the stench, basically. So it must have been quite horrific, also in Greece or Italy or wherever, to spend half a day there while your mates you're waiting for them to be disposed of in a acceptable.
Did they bury or burn?
It depends on the situation. I think the Greeks mostly cremated. I think there are also a few instances where they cremated when they had to take the bodies further back, when they wanted to take the bodies back home, because it's easier to carry the ashes than to carry the whole bodies, of course. I don't remember now. Cezary probably knows. I think the Persians were not cremated when they buried them, but I don't remember.
No, I'm not entirely sure.
Because they found more bodies at Marathon, and some of them were the Greeks, the Athenians were cremated as far as I know, but others were buried. I'm not sure if they included the Persians or also slaves. I'm not sure, but I remember there were also inhumations there, not just cremations. But that was at the battlefield itself, which was unusual also.
Isn't there's an incident where there's like a trench and they just dump everybody in it, and that's commented upon as being very, there's everybody, regardless of which city or culture they came from. There's an example of like a mass grave to stop the stench or the pollution.
They found one in Alicia. I don't know which side it was, but they found a trench there of the war dead.
I mean, one big issue which all that we discussed really raises with the stench, with the Mediterranean sun and all that, is of course, how do you identify them after they've been lying there for a few hours, often a few days? And that is actually a big problem and a big issue, because you must identify them somehow, but often it must have been really hard.
There is a reference to, I don't know if it's Greeks, but I know they attempt to pass a law in ancient Rome to actually stop it happening. I don't know how successful it is, but they actually cut off remove a bone as such, and usually it's a finger, to actually take home, so that they can actually have some sort of burial, something to bury or something to commemorate in the funeral at home as such, and then bury or cremate the rest.
Well, the famous example, of course, is Quintilius Varus, whose head is sent back by Maroboduus. And there's a couple of things that Augustus could have done, but in fact, what he does, he buries the head in the family tomb. So
even Ptolemy XV giving Caesar Pompey's head.
And he wept.
Yeah, as regard the identification of the war dead, there is an article, I think, in the book Hoplites, the Classical Greek Battle Experience, edited by Hansen. I don't remember the chapter particularly, but it was about some kind of dog tags or something used by the Spartans or something.
I think there was a mention in Diodorus, in which I think in one of the Messenian wars they were supposedly wearing like wooden sort of bracelets, but it seems very odd. But It was certainly a real issue, and there's this wonderful play which survives only, I think only half of it survives. It's, I think, Menander's Shield, and it's essentially a comedy, and it's about a warrior who goes to the battle, and then we don't know what happens to him, and then his slave arrives, and he's meant to identify his master. but the bodies have been lying there on the battlefield for 3 days in the sun. And so he comes and he says, oh, I can't tell whether this is my master or not. And then what he does is he sees that there's a shield next to him, so he says, oh, this is my master's shield, so that must be him. And then, of course, since it is actually a comedy, that's not his master, so then everything goes wrong because everyone assumes he's dead. So everyone essentially wants to take over his wealth and fortune. And then at the end, he obviously comes back. And what happened is he had to borrow a shield, and he was sold into slavery. But it's just evidence like this that shows that this really was an issue. And after a few days, it must have been really hard to recognize.
From ancient battles, we know that aside from the fact from people who survived, people who died and whose bodies were found, there were also people that were lost completely, of which no trace remained. So whether they were captured, or whether they just sank into a swamp or something, or they disappeared completely. Because there's always people missing also usually.
Yeah, I mean, this would be a really big issue in the naval battles, right? When you would just have to assume that a lot of people would just get lost, the bodies, because unless you recovered them pretty much immediately, they would first sort of sunk down, and then eventually they would probably come up. But with all the currents and everything, I mean, it would have been really hard. The way it worked in Athens is they had essentially 11 coffins, and for the 10 of them it was for each of the tribe. But there was also one coffin for this sort of unidentified warrior, and it may have been only for the naval battles, but maybe also for all the other ones that just got lost. I mean,
there is a tombstone in Italy on which it actually states, I fear that my body has been lost in a sea battle. I can't think of which one it was, and that the fear that is expressed on the tombstone is, I hope, God forbid that my body should wash up on the shore, and if it does, passerby, please lay a handful of dirt upon me so that I may have a proper burial.
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the famous examples is Marcus Caelius, the famous Roman here of the ancient region, who actually wasn't buried with the tombstone. In fact, it was his brother setting up the tombstone in memory of the brother who was lost, with, interestingly enough, his two freedmen. These heads in the background are actually two freedmen, who presumably were also lost on the campaign. So it's interesting that it would imply that it's important for the family to have the memory kept alive, even if they don't have the bones. And the hope may be one day you will find them.
Yeah, I was reminded of the reason that Artemisia's stratagem of ramming one of her own ships in the Battle of Salamis, the reason she got away with it is that the ship she rammed was lost with all hands. So, the entire crew of the Calydnian ship she rams, no one survives to be able to go, hang on a minute, you rammed us.
I actually feel that one issue that I really wanted to ask the Roman experts here, which I'm certainly not, but I found, like, doing my research in general, one issue that's really neglected with aftermath of battle is are the wounded, especially in the Greek sources. We just don't hear about them. I mean, there must have been really hundreds and hundreds of them. But our sources, at least for the Greek side, they just choose to neglect them. It's all about the dead, all about the glorious dead and how they sacrificed their lives. But there must have been hundreds and hundreds of wounded soldiers, and I mean, most of them would probably not make it. But I don't know how it is on the Roman side, whether we do hear about them, whether they are sort of celebrated in any way when they get back, because on the Greek side, it's just silence.
We hear wounds. I was reading. Is it at Pylos and Sphacteria that Thucydides records the wounded? I have it open here. Hang on, let me find it. So I think Thucydides does mention the wounded, but you're right. It's a very uncommon thing. We hear of wounds, and we hear of people surviving wounds. I think there probably is an estimation that as soon as people are wounded, the chances are they're going to die. I mean, for instance, at Thermopylae, the two men with the eye infections, Eurytus runs back to the battle so that he can die there, and Aristodemus sort of takes the option to not, but he survives. And those aren't battle wounds; they're camp fever, eye infections. But
the Roman legion, of course, does have its medicus and his team of Cezary, and they're presumably racing around the battlefield with carts and bandages and doing what they can. And if you look at Celsus, for example, there seems to be some relative expertise at cleaning wounds and extracting things like arrows and what have you, with some sort of expertise there. In the rare occasions where I think that battle casualties are recorded, the wounded are included in that number, from what I recall. But of course, what we don't find out is, well, 5 days later they died. One exception, however, is again in the Battle of Actium, where, of course, clearly Caesar and Agrippa win. But when you read the numbers, it's done at an immense cost. And a lot of the people who actually lived after the battle died very soon after. And that's actually made, I think, is either an Appian or one of those sources. So there was a recognition that, the wounded were probably not likely to survive in those cases, notwithstanding the medical treatment available.
So the funny thing is always in Homer, in the Iliad, when somebody gets hit in battle, it's either an insignificant wound, like a flesh wound or something, or a scratch basically, or it's instant death. There's never anybody who lingers in agony or gets an arm chopped off and survives or something. It's either it's insignificant or you're a goner, basically.
I think there are a couple of examples of people dying after lingering for a couple of days. When Epaminondas is taken from the field and having learned that they've been victorious at Mantinea, then he pulls out his own the wounding weapon and expires, which is very poetic. But I think that the chances of people having lingering deaths, especially with the kind of wounds and weapons that were inflicting them, there's a lot of screaming and yelling on the battlefield. We know from later conflicts that people can survive for half an hour with 8 bullets in their chest. So I think that the chances that they survive for longer and die of infection, but that's far less glorious in terms of our literary sources.
One of the issues I wrote in this story, there's a case in one of the cases I documented where analysis was done of a Greek warrior who actually did have, I think it was an arrow trapped in his bones, and he lived for quite a long time. His body seemed to heal around it. What was the immediate field treatment that was available?
You've got Philip II, and you've got Alexander the Great, and you've got
Antigonus,
Philopalamphus, all receiving really serious wounds. And okay, they are really famous people, so we don't have the, are they getting better treatment than anybody else would be getting?
Again, bringing up the example of Sceva, the Caesarian centurion, he rips out his own eye, and poetically described as squashing it with his foot. But I think they can, and I think the human body and its remarkable ability to heal, and getting into a controversial topic that has nothing to do with ancient warfare, in terms of their diet and the fact that they had no food that was modified or in any other way. They're eating and they're living healthy lifestyles, and their immunity systems. When you read about the things that can kill us, that we now have drugs for. People dying of tetanus, people dying of influenza, and which still happens. It's amazing that anyone lived beyond childhood throughout any period prior to the 20th century, and yet they did, and they lived for a long time. They are living healthy lifestyles, so they can recover from remarkable...
I will charge you a sec, but there's not a single ancient person alive today.
No, true. Well, unless you ask my children, because I was alive back then. But and I wrote an article on head wounds, and the number of skulls that we have surviving with clearly, quite traumatizing head wounds that the person didn't die from because there's bone healing, and trepanning and all that. Even Egyptian dentistry, they're inflicting amazing wounds deliberately and voluntarily on themselves and surviving from them. And from dentistry alone, they're making fake wooden teeth and all sorts of amazing things. So I think their survival rate, we have no evidence, which is Cezary's point, and there must have been people surviving from wounds. And for Romans to strip naked and say, look at all the wounds that I received in front, they've obviously recovered from those wounds.
Well, presumably it's blood loss, and then and after that it's your body fighting the infection. But blood loss would be the ultimate, the real killer on the battlefield.
And obviously after a few days it would have been the infection. And I think that's how Miltiades died. I think there was a siege of Paros, I think. And
he jumped over a fence. He jumped over a fence and he got a wound on his leg, and then it got infected and he died, which was a little bit.
So he's a victim of tetanus.
Right, I think that's probably enough for now. I'd like to thank Josho, Murray, Lindsay, Mark and Cezary. Don't forget, for more information on the magazine and how to subscribe, go to ancient-warfare.com. That's it for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.